Today, we have a somewhat uncomfortable conversation ahead of us, namely about the U.S. involvement in World War II, the confusion surrounding the start date of the conflict, cavalry versus tanks, atomic bombs, and much more. We would be happy to hear your suggestions for future videos in the comments. But for now, let's begin by heading to 1939. This year is traditionally considered the start of World War II. More specifically, September 1st of that year, the day Germany invaded Poland. This statement, of course, has every right to exist. However, as each year passes since the war, the history of World War II is becoming deeper, its consequences are being studied more thoroughly, more documents are being declassified, and historians from different countries are forming their own opinions on various issues. The start date of World War II has also been widely discussed in recent years across different countries. For example, one of the alternative dates is May 1939, when the Soviet Union and Japan clashed on the Mongolian-Manchurian border. The battles at Khalkhin Gol were massive and, for example, much larger than some of the individual battles of World War II. From the Soviet side, almost 60,000 people participated, while the Japanese side had 75,000. Casualties, according to various sources, also number in the tens of thousands. Moreover, this clash had a powerful influence on World War II. The crushing defeat of Japan became another brick in the process that led the country to focus its attention on the Pacific Ocean. Also, we should not forget the Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937. Descriptions of this conflict send a chill down your spine. Chemical weapons were used, the infamous Unit 731 was involved, and there were insane war crimes committed by the Japanese army. Even modest sources estimate civilian casualties at 12 million, and according to Chinese data, the total loss figure reaches up to 35 million. There are also other conflicts, the Italo-Ethiopian War, the Slovak-Hungarian War, as well as Japan's invasion of Manchuria. All these countries participated in World War II. Yes, the claim that World War II started on September 1st, 1939, is not exactly a myth, but it should not be assumed that everyone lived in neutrality before that. In fact, since the early 1930s, the world had already plunged into the depths of conflict, some of which were on a massive scale. The next topic of conversation almost veers into the realm of a total myth. It's the myth that World War II was a completely mechanized conflict of high-tech warfare for its time. Tanks against planes, submarines against battleships, and so on. Of course, such scenes appeared in films. However, it's important not to forget that, as with World War I, a huge amount of military equipment appeared a bit later when countries fully transitioned to a wartime footing. And in this case, the good old horses continued to play a key role, especially at the start of the war. In the German army, for example, in 1939, there were 514,000 horses in service, 3 times more than the number of mechanized transport units. At its peak, the number of active horses in the German army exceeded 1 million, and nearly 3 million horses served over the course of the war. At the height of the war, nearly every infantry division had a separate reconnaissance battalion of 200 cavalrymen. Should we mention that the situation in other countries was similar? Moreover, Soviet cavalry battalions on horseback participated in the offensive into Manchuria as late as August 1945. In general, the classics of warfare were very much present in World War II, and this inadvertently gave rise to the second myth connected to Poland. Everyone knows how quickly the country fell, and most people envision scenes of poor Polish cavalrymen charging with sabers against tanks. Such statements can even be found in textbooks, and this, of course, is a complete myth. It's based on the real battle at Kryanty. Of course, the Poles were not idiots and did not charge tanks with lances because there were no tanks at that battle. They arrived only toward the end. In reality, Polish cavalrymen even routed the Germans in this battle. Furthermore, an order for retreat was issued, but it was only canceled by General Guderian, who commanded to focus on machine guns and bring up armored vehicles. By the way, the Poles also had means to fight back. They had anti-tank guns and rifles in their arsenal. The German army was simply stronger and technically overpowered the enemy, and then used the victory to create the myth of the foolish Poles supposedly charging tanks with sabers. Since we're talking about Poland, let's also mention other smaller countries. History is written by the victors, and over time, terrible things can happen to it. Even the country that bore the heaviest burden can be forgotten, and textbooks usually don't even mention the smaller participants like Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia. Meanwhile, Romania's losses in World War II were greater than those of Britain and France combined, and this is just counting military casualties. When it comes to civilian casualties, not only Poland, but even Yugoslavia lost more people than France and Britain combined. Yugoslavia mobilized more people during the war than Italy, and Hungary lost more soldiers than France. The number of Greek civilians who died in World War II was greater than the number of Americans lost. Losses are a very sad and heavy topic, and honestly, it's hard to bring oneself to talk about it. We just hope that the world will remember not the myths and films, but the grim statistics and the full picture of events. As for the claim that the Allied landings in Normandy supposedly marked the decisive moment of World War II, we won't even mention it. We hope such obvious things don't need any further explanation. Let's instead talk about another movie myth. It's the one where, in almost every film, you can see neat lines of volunteers heading off to war. In reality, things were much sadder. In the United States, according to the National World War II Museum, only 38% of soldiers in World War II were volunteers, while nearly two-thirds were draftees, people who didn't exactly volunteer. For example, during the Vietnam War, which is so closely tied in popular culture to anti-war protests and pacifist movements, the situation was radically different. There, draftees made up only 25% of the total number, while more than two-thirds were volunteers. Of course, it's worth noting that in absolute terms, the number of those who served in World War II was higher, and this factor plays a role as well. But still, in percentage terms, the patriotism seen in Marvel movies with Captain America was more than enough. Now let's talk about Lend-Lease. It's common on the internet to come across pictures of buttons and other equipment that supposedly prove the USSR could only have won thanks to American aid. The fact of Lend-Lease is, of course, undeniable and legitimate. Moreover, the Soviet ace pilot Grigory Andreevich Reshkalov, who ranks second in the number of victories, made many successful sorties in a P-39 Airacobra. But the overwhelming majority of sources forget that most of the Lend-Lease goods reached the USSR in 1943 and later. According to a recent 2012 study on Lend-Lease, in 1941, the USSR purchased goods worth $741 million, but received only $541,000 worth. And this makes sense because there were severe logistical problems. In 1942, nearly 30% of the Lend-Lease volume was received, but the vast majority, over 70%, reached the USSR only after 1943, which is certainly great, but still, it's important not to exaggerate the role of Lend-Lease in World War II. Or at least, don't forget to pay attention to other figures, which show that the USSR actually received only 27% of the total aid, while the United Kingdom received nearly 70%. Let's also talk about atomic bombs. The explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the culmination of World War II, and of course, their effect has been greatly exaggerated. Let's start by saying that before the first atomic bomb explosion, the US had already carried out large-scale bombings of 66 Japanese cities. For buildings and people, it doesn't matter whether they're bombed by fire or atomic energy. The mere fact of being bombed is enough. On March 10, 1945, 334 B-29 bombers attacked Tokyo and turned it into hell. The damage was quite comparable to that of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Entire residential areas were reduced to ashes, and the aerial maps before and after the bombings looked just as terrifying, and that's only March 10th. A little earlier, on February 23rd, 174 bombers carried out similar raids. If you look at the whole history, Tokyo had already been bombed in 1944. There were also other cities in Japan that suffered similar devastation. Yes, atomic bombings, among other things, had a psychological effect. But most historians agree that the main reason for Japan's surrender was the Soviet Union entering the war against them. For a long time, there was a widespread myth that the Germans were also close to developing an atomic bomb, which is completely untrue. It's important to distinguish between missile carriers and bombs themselves. The Germans were indeed ahead of everyone else in missile technology, But when it came to the atom, they didn't succeed. For detailed explanations, it's better to turn to the channels of physicists. But the established view in the scientific community is that the Germans initially chose the wrong path in their nuclear program. By the end of the war, their reactor in Haigerloch still hadn't been operational, whereas the Americans were already preparing to test fully functional atomic bombs. Of course, the dire situation on the German front played its role, but most physicists believe that with the progress made by 1943, the Germans would have needed another 5 to 10 years to fully master the technology. And even then, it's not certain, since supply chains were already starting to crack at that time. But let's wrap up with resistance. In films, we often see brave French people who, as a nation, became partisans to fight the Germans. In reality, only about 0.5% of the country's population was actively involved in resistance movements against the invaders. Moreover, according to even Western experts on the subject, like Robert Paxton, most of these actions ended in failure. In his view, as well as that of many scholars, the complete absence of French resistance would not have affected the outcome of World War II in any way. While this doesn't diminish the heroism of those involved, partisans in Belarus, Ukraine, and the RSFSR played a much more significant role. And if we're talking about Europe, it was the Yugoslavs who caused the real havoc. Consider the republics founded by partisans directly in territories occupied by the Germans. These republics were quite large, and this was in 1941 and 1942, the height of the German army's power. In general, we strongly recommend everyone to look into the involvement of not only the major powers in World War II, but also the smaller European countries, because even in terms of statistics and numbers, it was incredibly intense there. And with that, we'll wrap up. Of course, these are far from all the myths related to World War II. Talking about this war is very difficult, but still, its events, sacrifices, and feats must be remembered, if only so they are not repeated. Unfortunately for humanity, it's likely that this won't be possible. Until we meet again, friends.